It stands in defiance of time and the salt-laced wind. The stone lace of its towers pierces the humid Texas sky, and its griffins, frozen in an eternal watch, gaze upon the waters of the Gulf of Mexico with aristocratic disdain. For the thousands of tourists who pass through its massive oak doors each year, it is a fairy tale frozen in granite. The Bishop's Palace, the indestructible heart of Galveston. Within its walls, history doesn't sound like an echo, but like a living voice. Every stained glass window, refracting the sunlight, seems to tell a story of resilience. Every fireplace, long gone cold, holds the warmth of hundreds of saved lives. This building is more than architecture. It's a symbol of survival, an ark that stood fast when the apocalypse descended upon this island. But every heart has its secret, and this one, made of stone, is dark and deep. To see it, you must look away from the majestic facade and turn to an old, faded photograph, to a man with hard eyes and tightly pressed lips, a face carved not from stone, but from pure calculation. His name is Walter Gresham, lawyer, railroad baron, architect of his own destiny, and this is his house. This exquisite carving we admire today was not paid for with mere money. It was paid for with ruthless ambition. Every granite block in these walls is a land grant, received from the state and sold for a profit. Every mahogany panel is control over trade routes, seized in a corporate war. This castle was not born from a love of beauty. It was born from a thirst for eternity. Gresham was a product of his time, the Gilded Age, an era when fortunes were made as quickly as reputations were ruined. He saw the world as an arena where the strongest survive, and his home was to be a monument to that philosophy, a fortress for his dynasty, an eternal testament to his triumph. Today, we see these walls as a sanctuary that saved hundreds of people during the Great Storm of 1900. But he wasn't building a sanctuary, he was building a fortress. And therein lies the central paradox. How did a monument to one man's personal greed become the ultimate symbol of an entire city's survival? How did a castle born of pride acquire a soul that its creator never intended to give it? To understand this stone heart, one must descend into the dark mines where the capital that built it was extracted. To understand the castle, one must understand its creator. Before the castle, there was the roar of steel, the sound that defined the 19th century. We think of them as the arteries of progress, connecting the country. But back then, in post-Civil War Texas, they were blades, carving the continent into spheres of influence. And Walter Gresham, a former Confederate soldier, understood. He who controls the steel controls everything. He arrived in Galveston not as a Texan by birth, but as a conqueror by vocation. He didn't seek glory on the battlefield. His weapons were the paragraphs of laws and stock market quotes. His goal was control, and his instrument was a company with an ambitious name, the Gulf, Colorado, and Santa Fe Railway. On paper, it was a project meant to connect the port of Galveston with the interior of Texas and beyond, to the west. But in reality, it was a financial leviathan built on a brilliant and ruthless scheme. Picture a map of Texas, an empty, vast space. The state legislature, desperate for infrastructure, made the railroad barons an offer they couldn't refuse. For every mile of track laid, the company received 16 sections of land, 10,240 acres, for every single mile. It was a perpetual motion machine of enrichment. The land, received for free, was immediately sold to farmers and speculators. The money from the sale financed the laying of the next mile of track, and each new mile brought even more free land. Gresham and his partners weren't building the railroad with their own money. They were building it with the money of the future, selling land they hadn't even owned the day before. It was genius. But for Gresham, simply playing by the rules wasn't enough. He decided to write them. As a state congressman, he personally lobbied for and pushed through laws that expanded land grants and provided tax exemptions. For whom? For companies just like his own. Every strike of the gavel in the state capitol turned into the jingle of gold coins in the pockets of shareholders in Galveston. But he wasn't alone on this field. His main enemy was Collis Huntington, one of the titans of American railroads. Huntington already controlled the exits from Galveston, and his monopoly was suffocating the city. This was not mere competition. This was war. A war for the right to dictate the shipping prices of white gold, cotton, which was the lifeblood of the entire Southern economy. To control the routes out of Galveston meant to have a hand on the throat of thousands of farmers and merchants. Gresham joined the fight. He used his legal talents to evade Huntington's traps, his political connections to gain preferential treatment, and his financial genius to attract investors. He built his railroad not just as a transportation route, but as a battering ram, smashing the enemy's monopoly. And in 1886, he delivered the decisive blow. He became the lead negotiator in the sale of his creation, the GCNSF, to a true giant, the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe. This wasn't just a deal, it was a coronation. And here is the price: $8,000 per share, in an era when a skilled worker earned less than $2 a day. For Gresham, one of the founders and largest shareholders, it was a fortune of biblical proportions. These figures, recorded in the sales agreement, are not just an accounting entry. They are molten granite. They are steel beams not yet cast in Carnegie's factories. They are the foundation of a castle that hadn't even been laid. This was the price of power. He had his fortune. Now he needed a throne. And he found a place for it, on the main street of Galveston, right under the noses of the old aristocracy he intended to eclipse. 1887. Walter Gresham stands on an empty plot of land on Broadway Avenue. Around him is Galveston, the jewel of the South. Elegant, almost ethereal Victorian-style mansions line the street. These are the homes of old money, fortunes built on the cotton trade before the war, houses of wood and intricate latticework, beautiful, graceful, and incredibly fragile. Gresham looks at them not with admiration, but with the cold contempt of a strategist. He sees not architecture, but vulnerability. The wood rots in the salty, humid air. It burns in the frequent fires. It turns to splinters under the onslaught of a hurricane's wind. His neighbors built their homes on an illusion of permanence. He would build his on the certainty of strength. In his hands are not just blueprints. In his hands is a declaration. He summons Nicholas Clayton, the most fashionable architect in the city. An Irishman, a Catholic, a master of Gothic forms. But Gresham doesn't ask him for beauty. He demands power from him. On Clayton's sketches, something Galveston has never seen before comes to life. Not a house, but a fortress. Not a villa, but a castle. The chateauesque style, an imitation of the French chateau of the Loire Valley. But this is not a tribute to European fashion. It is a calculated challenge. To the aristocrats of the Old South, who prided themselves on their lineage, it was a statement. You pride yourselves on your ancestors? I am my own ancestor. My dynasty begins here and now. For America's new money, it was a way to instantly buy a history they didn't have, to build an ancestral home that looked as if it had stood for centuries. Every line on Clayton's blueprint is an order from Gresham, translated into the language of architecture. Asymmetrical towers soaring into the sky are a symbol of untamable ambition. Steep, hipped roofs covered in slate are a shield against fire and the elements. Massive stone walls are armor against time. The choice of materials is a manifesto. Pink Texas granite, rough, almost wild, a symbol of the land he conquered, and smooth, cream-colored Indiana limestone, expensive and refined, a symbol of the capital he earned, a combination of raw power and polished wealth. From the very beginning, this building was not designed for comfort. It was designed for dominance. Its silhouette was meant to tower over the neighboring mansions, casting a shadow on them in both a literal and figurative sense. Its windows are not friendly openings, but battlements from which the master would survey his domain. Gresham's neighbors, the old elite, built their homes to entertain guests. Gresham built his to accept surrenders. Here, in his stone citadel, deals that would determine the future of Texas were to be made. Here, his 9 children were to grow up understanding that their family name was synonymous with power. This is not just an architectural project. It is an act of war, a declaration carved in stone and addressed to the entire world. You built your empires on cotton that rots and wood that burns. I will build mine on granite and steel. You cling to the past. I own the future. My legacy will be eternal. But before he could challenge time, he had to challenge nature itself. He had chosen the most unstable battlefield imaginable for his fortress. He decided to build a mountain on sand. Any engineer of that time, looking at the castle's blueprints and the land where it was to be built, would have said one word: madness. Galveston is not the mainland. It is a barrier island, essentially a giant sandbar washed up by the ocean over thousands of years. Elegant, capricious, constantly changing under the assault of waves and winds. To build a light wooden house here was already a risk. To build a multi-ton stone castle was engineering suicide. The ground beneath your feet is not solid rock, but an unstable mixture of sand and silt, saturated with salt water. It lives, it breathes, it moves. To place thousands of tons of granite on it was like building a cathedral on the surface of a swamp. But for Walter Gresham, the word impossible was just a reason to increase the budget. And so began the first, invisible battle in his war for eternity. A war with the sand. In archival photographs, we see only the chaos of a construction site: mounds of earth, wooden supports, dozens of people with shovels. But what was really happening was a desperate grapple with geology. Hundreds of workers, mostly Irish and German immigrants, dug into the earth. Their task was to dig down to a denser layer of clay that lay somewhere deep below. It was hellish labor. The Galveston heat, multiplied by 100% humidity, turned the excavation pit into a steam room. But the main problem was water. The island's water table was only a few feet from the surface. Every swing of a shovel released a new stream. The pit constantly filled with murky, salty sludge. The sand walls crumbled, threatening to bury the workers alive. Day after day, they fought. They dug, reinforced the walls with wooden shoring, bailed out water with buckets, and installed primitive steam pumps that worked at the very limit of their capacity. It was a race, to dig deeper before everything around them collapsed again. Every inch won from the island was a small victory. It was here, in this muddy pit, that the castle's fate was decided. Nicholas Clayton and his engineers designed a foundation of incredible strength for a residential home. Deep, wide, made of massive stone blocks, bonded with cement. It was to become an artificial bedrock, a platform that would distribute the building's colossal weight over the largest possible area. The Gresham Castle's foundation is its hidden hero. Tourists don't see it. Architectural historians don't admire it. But it is these stones, laid in the island's depths with inhuman effort, that became the key to its immortality. Gresham must have visited the construction site often. He would stand at the edge of the pit, looking at the people toiling below, and see not chaos, but the embodiment of his will. He had challenged the very earth on which he stood, and he was winning. He forced the workers to sink a granite base capable of supporting a mountain into the unstable sand. He had won his first war. Now all he had to do was deliver that mountain. In pieces. The Gresham Castle is not just a building constructed in Galveston. It is a building assembled from all over America. To understand the scale of his ambition, one needs to look not at the blueprints, but at a map of the United States, and to imagine a giant logistical operation, unthinkable for a private individual. This was a mountain, delivered in pieces. It all begins here, in Texas. The Marble Falls quarries. Dozens of workers blast the hillsides with dynamite, breaking off giant blocks of pink granite. This stone, with its rough, almost primeval texture, was to become the castle's armor, its outer skin. Each block, weighing several tons, was dressed, numbered, and then loaded onto the flat cars of his own, Gresham's railroad. The trains, breathing heavily, crept hundreds of miles south to the coast. But Texas might was not enough for Gresham. He needed refinement. And he found it 1,000 miles from home, in the quarries of Indiana. From there, from the very heart of the Midwest, trains carried perfectly white, fine-grained limestone to the south. This stone was intended for the window surrounds, arches, and decorative carvings. It was to become the lace on the granite armor, white and pink, refinement and strength. Two stones from two different worlds were to meet on a tiny plot of land in Galveston. And then, steel. In the residential homes of that era, steel frames were an almost unimaginable luxury. But Gresham wasn't building a house. He was building a fortress, and its skeleton had to be made of the strongest material known to man. The order went to Pittsburgh, to the steel empire of Andrew Carnegie. Dozens of I-beams, each cast to a special order, began a long journey by rail, crossing half the country to become the unbreakable bones of the future castle. But even that wasn't enough. Gresham's ambitions knew no bounds. The roof had to shine under the southern sun. 22 tons of copper were ordered and delivered by ship. The interiors required wood that didn't exist in Texas. And so, ships laden with precious timber began to arrive in Galveston from the ports of South America and Asia. Mahogany, rosewood, satinwood, entire fortunes in the form of logs, destined to become panels, staircases, and doors. Dozens of trains, dozens of ships, all of them carrying parts of the future castle to a single point on the map. The construction site on Broadway Avenue was transformed into a miniature international port and railway hub. Here they unloaded granite from Texas, limestone from Indiana, steel from Pennsylvania, tiles from Ohio, copper from Arizona, and wood from all over the world. It was a logistical nightmare and simultaneously a triumph of organizational genius. Walter Gresham, a man who made his fortune controlling the flow of transport, was now using the full power of the American industrial machine to realize his personal fantasy. He wasn't just building a house. He was assembling it, like a puzzle, from the finest and strongest materials money could buy. Every stone that arrived in Galveston was a symbol of his power. He could reach into any corner of the country and the world and bring back whatever he desired. He was assembling his mountain, and soon he would need hands capable of putting it together. The materials had been delivered. The mountain had arrived in pieces, but by itself, it was just a dead collection of stone and metal. To turn it into a castle, it needed human strength. It needed hands. And those hands belonged to men whose names history has barely preserved. The construction site of the Gresham Castle was a Babylon of the Gilded Age. Workers from all over America and Europe flocked here, to the humid, salty air of Galveston. The rough Texan dialect of the local laborers mingled here with Irish accents, German deliberateness, and Italian musicality. For the heaviest work, digging the foundation, carrying stones, mixing mortar, they hired Irish immigrants, men who had fled from famine, willing to do any labor for a few cents an hour. Their muscles laid the castle's foundation, their sweat mixed with the cement. For the woodwork, for creating the intricate panels and staircases, Gresham and Clayton brought in German carpenters, masters whose skills had been passed down from generation to generation. They arrived with their own tools, their understanding of wood structure, their almost religious precision. Every joint, every detail carved by their hands was flawless, but the most complex work was with the stone. To transform blocks of limestone into griffins, sea monsters, and floral garlands required not just workers. It required artists, and they were found among Italian stone carvers. These men brought with them the secrets of a craft that was hundreds, if not thousands, of years old. They saw a hidden figure within a formless block, and their hammers and chisels, blow by blow, freed it from its stone prison. This international team of craftsmen was a source of brilliant solutions, but also of constant tension. The visiting specialists were paid more. They were valued for their unique skills, and this caused quiet envy and discontent among the local workers. The construction site was not just a place of work. It was a melting pot where cultures, languages, and class interests collided. And over all of this hung the ruthless reality of the time. The working conditions were hellish. The scorching Texas sun, humidity that made clothes stick to the body a minute after starting work. No hard hats, no safety ropes, no safety regulations in the modern sense. Workers balanced on flimsy wooden scaffolding dozens of feet in the air. They lifted multi-ton blocks using primitive winches and steam cranes, where a snapped cable or an operator's mistake could lead to instant death. Stone dust clogged their lungs. Sharp fragments flew into their eyes. The price of a single mistake wasn't a reprimand. The price was a life. We don't know exactly how many people were injured on this site. Such records weren't kept back then. But we can be certain that every element of this luxurious castle, every elegant detail we see today, was created under conditions we would call unbearable. This is not just a house built with one man's money. It is a monument created by the sweat and risk of hundreds of nameless workers, with hands that turned a pile of materials into a work of art, with hands that built a castle for a king in which they themselves could never live. From the outside, it was a castle from the past, but inside, beneath its thick stone skin, beat the heart of the future. Walter Gresham, the man who built his empire on the most advanced technology of his time, the railroad, demanded the same uncompromising engineering for his home. He was building a monument, but he was a pragmatist, and he knew the ultimate secret to longevity. While stonemasons carved griffins on the facade and newspapers discussed the building's medieval appearance, a quiet revolution was taking place on the construction site. Inside the massive granite walls, workers were erecting something almost unthinkable for a residential home of that era. They were assembling a steel skeleton. This was the technology of skyscrapers, then being born in Chicago and New York. The idea was that the load-bearing stress wasn't carried by the walls themselves, but by an internal frame of steel beams. The walls become merely a shell, a protective skin. For a commercial building, this was logical. For a private mansion, it was an insane, incredibly expensive redundancy. But this very redundancy was Gresham's goal. Using modern technology, we can peer inside the walls and see what has been hidden from view for over 100 years. Dozens of steel beams cast in Carnegie's mills are joined with rivets into a strong, indestructible structure. They run from the foundation all the way to the roof, bearing the weight of the floors, the towers, and thousands of tons of stone. Gresham wasn't building a mansion. He was building a skyscraper disguised as a castle. This dual system of protection, steel bones and stone skin, made the building virtually invulnerable. It could withstand not only time, but also the most ferocious forces of nature. The steel frame gave it flexibility and tensile strength, while the thick stone walls provided incredible mass and resistance to direct impact. In archival footage, we can see how this system came together. Primitive steam cranes, creaking and smoking, slowly lift giant granite blocks into the air, each weighing several tons. Workers, standing on rickety scaffolding at dizzying heights, guide them into place. With surgical precision, using only crowbars and wedges, they fit the stone block against the steel beam, leaving a minimal gap. The void between steel and stone is then filled with cement mortar. Bone and skin fuse into a single monolithic organism. It was a hymn to the engineering of the Gilded Age, an era that believed that with steel, steam, and human will, any element could be conquered. Nicholas Clayton, the architect, and Walter Gresham, the client, created a hybrid creature. On the outside, it spoke the language of medieval aristocracy, but its internal structure spoke the language of the Industrial Revolution. This hidden steel strength is the castle's greatest secret, the secret to its survival. Gresham invested a fortune not in what was visible, but in what was hidden. He built a house that was stronger than any other for hundreds of miles around. He created his stone monster. And now, he would have to hear what the city thought of it. While hammers thundered and winches creaked on Broadway Avenue, in the quiet drawing rooms and editorial offices of Galveston, quills scratched. The castle grew, and with it grew a sense of bewilderment mixed with envy. The city, accustomed to the elegance of wooden villas, looked upon the rising stone monster with poorly concealed horror, and public opinion found a name for it. Not the castle, not the palace, but Gresham's folly. Newspaper columns of the time are filled with scathing hints and outright mockery. Actors reading these lines let us hear the voices of the past. Our esteemed fellow citizen, Mr. Gresham, is evidently preparing for a siege. One can only guess who his enemy is: the Northern Yankees or the pirates of the Caribbean. A structure whose ponderousness would be better suited to the Scottish Highlands than our sunny coast. Perhaps its owner fears the island might float away to sea and has decided to nail it to the ground with this granite. Anchor. To spend $250,000 on a private residence in these trying times is not just a demonstration of wealth. It is a challenge to all notions of modesty and common sense. These were the voices of Galveston's old elite, people whose families had owned the city for decades. Their fortunes, built on cotton, seemed noble and unshakable to them, and Gresham was an upstart. A railroad baron, a man of new money, earned through deals they considered coarse and aggressive. His house violated all the unspoken rules of their world. It was too big. Its towers brazenly invaded the sky, blocking the sun from their neighbors. It disrupted the harmony of the street, which was lined with light, almost airy structures. It was too expensive. In a city where a luxurious mansion could be built for $20,000, Gresham was spending 10 times that amount. It was indecent. It was insulting. And most importantly, it was too permanent. Their wooden houses were vulnerable, and they knew it. They lived in constant fear of fire and hurricanes. Their wealth was tied to the cotton harvest and stock market prices, things that were volatile and capricious. But Gresham was building as if he had discovered the secret to immortality. His house of granite and steel was a silent rebuke to their own fragility. Every new stone laid in its walls was another argument in the debate Gresham was having with the entire city. He didn't respond to the newspaper articles. He didn't engage in debates at the clubs. He just kept building. He let his castle speak for itself, and the castle spoke. It declared that the old rules no longer applied, that the cotton kings were being replaced by the railroad barons. That power was now measured not in acres of plantations, but in miles of steel track. Gresham's folly. They thought it was an insult, but for him, it might have been the highest compliment. After all, a folly is something only a person with absolute power can afford. The power to ignore the opinions of others. The power to build one's own reality, stone by stone. When you look at the castle from a distance, you see only power and majesty, but step closer, and the stone begins to speak. It tells stories. The facade of Gresham's castle is not just a wall, it's a stone book, filled with symbols, allusions, and perhaps encrypted insults. Every detail here has meaning. At the main entrance, we are greeted by griffins, mythical creatures, half lion, half eagle. In the ancient world, they were the guardians of treasure. Gresham, a man whose wealth was legendary, places them at his doorstep. It's an unambiguous message. Everything inside is mine, and it is well protected. Above the arches and windows, we see the face of Neptune, god of the sea, with his trident and flowing beard. This is a tribute to the source of all Galveston's wealth. The city lived and breathed trade. Its pulse was the ocean tide. Gresham, who controlled the routes to the port, effectively controlled that pulse. The image of Neptune on his house is a claim of ownership over the element itself. But the most interesting things are hidden not in the obvious symbols, but in the small details. In the whimsical, almost chaotic carvings that entwine the columns and cornices. Here, among the acanthus leaves and floral garlands, hides an entire bestiary. Dragons, chimeras, grotesque masks, and the faces of unknown creatures. It is here that one of the castle's most enduring legends is born. The legend of the faces in the stone. It is said that the Italian stonemasons who worked on the site left their silent messages here, that among the dozens of carved faces, they hid caricatures. Of the client, Walter Gresham, with his stern gaze and commanding chin. Of the architect, Nicholas Clayton, perhaps with a compass in hand or wearing a hat. And even of themselves, the tired but proud faces of the common workers. It was a quiet revenge, or perhaps a joke, from the men who spent day after day under the scorching sun, carving another man's dream from stone. They were nameless creators, but they found a way to leave their mark. Not a signature, but an encrypted self-portrait that would look out at the world for centuries. Today, using modern optics, we are trying to unravel this mystery. We peer into every swirl, every chip in the limestone. This mask here, with the heavy brows, doesn't it resemble Gresham from a well-known photograph? And this mustachioed devil with a mischievous squint, could it be one of the Italian masters, immortalizing himself in stone? We will never know for sure. It is a secret the stone will keep forever. But the very possibility turns the facade from a simple set of decorations into a silent dialogue between eras. A dialogue between the powerful client, the brilliant architect, and the nameless craftsman who poured not only their labor, but a piece of their souls into this stone. They created an indestructible shell for Gresham, full of secret meanings. Now, it was time to fill that shell with treasures. From the outside, the castle was a statement of power. Inside, it was meant to be a hymn to luxury. If the facade was its armor, then the interiors were the treasure trove that armor protected. The longest and most painstaking phase began, filling the fortress with jewels. The center of this new world was the main staircase, a grandiose structure of solid oak, soaring up 3 stories. But the true masterpiece was not in the wood, but in the light. Alongside the staircase, a gigantic stained glass window rises to a height of 40 feet. This is not just a window. It is a painting made of glass and light. We see it being delivered, packed in dozens of crates. We see artisans, as if assembling a precious mosaic, connecting hundreds of pieces of colored glass with lead cames. Biblical and allegorical scenes come to life upon it. Every ray of sunlight passing through it would shatter into 1,000 colored reflections, flooding the hall with a kaleidoscope of ruby, sapphire, and emerald hues. The cost of this window alone was comparable to the cost of an entire neighboring house. Then came the wood. Gresham wanted each room to have its own character, its own unique voice. And this voice was created using the rarest types of wood. For the dining room, panels of American oak were brought in, massive, respectable, speaking of stability and tradition. For the library, rosewood was chosen, dark, almost black, with a deep, rich grain. It created an atmosphere of concentration and wisdom. And the formal drawing room was finished with satinwood, an exotic wood with a golden, silky sheen that seemed to radiate light of its own. Dozens of woodcarvers worked for months, if not years. They weren't just paneling walls. They were creating works of art. Every door frame, every ceiling beam, every panel was covered in the most intricate carvings. It was the same language of symbols as on the facade, but translated into the warmth and aroma of wood. And finally, fire. Galveston's humid climate made fireplaces not just a luxury, but a necessity. But for Gresham, they were also collector's items. 14 fireplaces. And no 2 were alike. They were brought in from all over the world. One was of Mexican onyx, with its translucent, layered structure. Another, of black marble imported from Italy, was austere and monumental. A third was of carved oak, with caryatids and masks. But the jewel of the collection was a fireplace Gresham acquired after the World's Fair. It was made of silver and had won first prize at the exhibition. To install an exhibit acknowledged as the world's best in his own home, it was a gesture that perfectly suited his character. Step by step, room by room, the empty stone box was filled with life and meaning. This was no longer just a construction project. This was a jewelry box being slowly and meticulously filled. Every stained glass window, every wooden panel, every fireplace. It wasn't just decoration. It was another jewel in Walter Gresham's crown. He was creating his perfect world, his personal universe. But beyond the walls of his castle, the real world was preparing to strike, and Gresham was running out of time. 1891. Construction has been underway for 4 years. The deadlines have long passed, and the initial budget has been exceeded many times over. The castle had turned into an insatiable monster, devouring money at a terrifying rate. But Walter Gresham presses on. He hurries the workers, demands faster deliveries, and personally oversees every stage. From the outside, It looked like the obsession of a perfectionist. But in reality, it was a cold calculation. It was a race. Against the backdrop of construction sounds, the banging of hammers and the screech of saws, another sound begins to emerge, faint but ominous, the ticking of a clock. Gresham, a brilliant financier, a man whose fortune was built on his ability to foresee economic cycles, could not have missed the tremors running through the nervous system of the American economy. The Gilded Age, an era of unrestrained growth and speculation, was coming to an end. The air was electric. Railroad company stocks, which had seemed unshakable just yesterday, began to behave unpredictably. Banks were becoming increasingly reluctant to issue loans. A storm was brewing, a financial storm that would go down in history as the Panic of 1893, one of the most devastating economic crises in United States history. Gresham must have seen it coming. He saw small banks failing, production shrinking, his former colleagues in the railroad business growing ever more cautious. He understood that the window of opportunity, a time when one could spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on a personal project, was rapidly closing. His castle, this monument to his financial might, could turn into a monument to his bankruptcy. If the crisis had hit a year earlier, construction would have stopped. The grandiose structure would have stood unfinished, gaping with empty windows, an eternal symbol of hubris punished by the market. He, a man who never lost, could not allow such a disgrace. And the race accelerates. The last stained glass windows are fitted into their frames at night by the light of gas lamps. Woodcarvers work in 2 shifts. Decorators paint the ceilings while the plaster beneath them is still drying. Every week, every day counts. He has to make it. He has to finish this monument to himself before his financial empire begins to crumble under the blows of the crisis. This was Walter Gresham's final, most desperate battle. Not against sand, not against stone, not against public opinion. It was a battle against time, against the inexorable pendulum of economic history, which had already begun its downward swing. He put everything on the line. He poured his last available funds into completing the project, perhaps neglecting other investments. The castle had to be finished, at any cost, before the clock struck midnight for the entire American economy. 1892. He had made it. The day for which all of this was intended arrives. Workers removed the last of the wooden scaffolding that had hidden the building from the world for 5 long years. Like a butterfly emerging from its cocoon, the castle slowly revealed itself to Galveston in all its power and defiant beauty. A moment of silence. The construction dust settles, and the city sees it. It was a shock, a triumph, undeniable proof of victory. All the ridicule about Gresham's folly fell silent. Before them stood not madness, but a work of art, complete, whole, overwhelming in its power. The pink granite and white limestone played in the sun. The copper roof burned like fire. The griffins looked down on passers-by as if they had just taken their posts. The camera slowly circles the building, taking in all its sides. We see it as it was seen on that first day. Every detail in its place, every tower reaching for the sky, every window gleaming in the sun. This is no longer a construction site. It is a monument. Walter Gresham had won. He had conquered the unstable soil. He had overcome logistical nightmares. He had defeated public opinion. And most importantly, he had beaten time, outrunning the financial crash by a matter of months. While the rest of America braced for a prolonged depression, he stood on the threshold of his own personal, indestructible kingdom. The moment for which everything was built has come. The massive 14-foot oak doors swing open. On the threshold stand Walter Gresham, his wife Josephine, and their 9 children. They step inside. The doors close behind them with a dull, heavy thud. Inside, they are met by a silence filled with the smell of fresh varnish and wood. Light, refracted through the giant stained glass window, floods the hall with colored patterns. The fireplaces, never before lit, await their moment. This is their world, their fortress, their universe. The Gresham family, kings and queens in their new castle. Here, within these thick walls, they were protected from everything, from the envious glances of their neighbors, from the economic storms that were already beginning to shake the country, from the salt wind and the scorching sun. He had done it. He had built his eternity, or so it seemed. He had created the perfect stage for the long and glorious history of his dynasty. But he had failed to consider one thing. Sometimes, the most ruthless enemies are not on the outside. They are already within. And one of them is life itself. The castle came to life. Its stone heart began to beat. In the evenings, hundreds of gas jets filled the rooms with a warm light that streamed through the stained glass windows, turning the house into a giant magic lantern. The creak of carriages on the driveway, the laughter of guests in the grand drawing room, the quiet whispers of business partners in the library. The fortress became the center of Galveston's power. Here, in the dining room paneled with dark oak, Walter Gresham received the men upon whom the entire Texas economy depended. At this table, the fates of railway lines were decided, cotton export deals were struck, and political intrigues were woven. The castle worked exactly as intended. It wasn't just a home, but a machine for consolidating power. Every detail of the interior, from the silver fireplace to the carved panels, was meant to remind guests who was master here. Josephine Gresham, his wife, became the queen of this world. She hosted lavish receptions that were the talk of the town. The music drifting from the ballroom became the soundtrack to the final days of the Gilded Age. For their 9 children, the castle was a magical playground, an endless labyrinth of rooms, towers, and secret corners. The Gresham dynasty had put down roots in the granite foundation. But there was one, most cruel irony in this perfect picture. Walter Gresham, the man who so desperately sought eternity, who built a house capable of surviving centuries, could not defeat his own mortality. He, the king of this castle, lived in it for only a few years. His health, undermined by decades of ruthless struggle for a place in the sun, began to rapidly decline. We see him no longer as a powerful baron, but as a tired man, sitting by the fireplace in his library. He looks at his business papers, but his thoughts are perhaps already far away. He had built his fortress, but now he was its prisoner. He had created a perfect world, but he had no time left to live in it. In 1893, just 1 year after its completion, Walter Gresham died. The king was dead, but the castle remained. And then, the queen stepped forward. Josephine Gresham. She did not leave the house. On the contrary, she became its guardian. For the next 29 years, the castle transformed from a symbol of her husband's ambition into her sanctuary. The noisy receptions ceased. The house fell silent, immersed in quiet and memories. Josephine kept everything exactly as it had been during her husband's life. Every book in the library, every porcelain statuette, every painting, everything remained in its place. The house became not just a memorial, but a time capsule, preserving the spirit of a bygone era. She lived here, surrounded by the ghosts of the past, a widow in her granite mausoleum. She had no idea that the greatest test for her husband's creation was yet to come, and that it would be she, the quiet and grieving guardian, who would have to make the most important decision in the castle's history, a decision that would change its destiny forever. September 8th, the year 1900. The morning begins with a sense of dread. The sky over Galveston takes on a strange, sick, copper-yellow hue. The wind, which had previously been merely persistent, turns into a furious howl. Barometers are dropping at an alarming rate. The deadliest hurricane in United States history is heading straight for them. By noon, the city is in agony. Winds of 145 miles per hour rip off roofs and shatter windows. The rain falls not in streams, but as a solid wall. But the most terrible enemy doesn't come from the sky. It comes from the sea. The Gulf of Mexico, enraged by the hurricane, rises. A gigantic storm surge, over 15 feet high, washes over the island and crashes down upon the city. Galveston, a city of elegant wooden houses, ceases to exist in a matter of hours. The water rushing through the streets turns into a monstrous battering ram. It lifts houses from their foundations like children's toys, smashes them into one another, and tears them apart. The streets become a churning torrent, carrying wreckage, furniture, and the bodies of people and animals. The sound of destruction, a relentless roar and the crack of splintering wood, mixes with the screams of thousands of people caught unprepared. And in the midst of this apocalypse, this watery hell, it stands, the Gresham Castle. Waves batter its granite walls, but the stone doesn't even tremble. The wind howls around its towers, but the roof tiles hold firm. The wreckage of neighboring houses, once proud mansions, slams into its facade and shatters into splinters. The steel skeleton hidden within holds strong. The fortress, built to protect against imaginary enemies, is fighting a real one. Inside, in the semi-darkness, behind the massive oak doors, is Josephine Gresham. She hears the chaos outside. She sees through the windows as the world she knew disappears into the murky water. And she makes a decision. She orders the doors to be opened. It was an act of incredible courage. To let a crowd, mad with terror, into her home, into her treasure trove, was a risk. But she did it. Hundreds of people, her neighbors, their servants, strangers who had managed to swim to the castle, pour inside. Wet, injured, in a state of shock, they fill the magnificent hall. They huddle together on the oak staircase, under the protection of a giant stained glass window. The castle, built as a monument to one man's ego, becomes an ark. The fortress, created to protect wealth, becomes a shelter, saving hundreds of lives. Every detail into which Gresham had poured his pride now serves a higher purpose. The thick walls that were meant to shut him off from the world now protect that world from death. The solid foundation, laid with such effort, now supports not only the weight of the castle, but the weight of human hope. On that terrible night, when between 6,000 and 12,000 people died, Walter Gresham's castle fulfilled a destiny its creator had never imagined. It became a symbol not of power, but of mercy, not of wealth, but of salvation. It endured, and in doing so, it gave others a chance to endure as well. When the water receded, it left behind a world of ruin and silence. Galveston lay in ruins, but rising above this devastated landscape, almost unscathed, was the castle. The storm had torn a copper dragon figurine from its roof, leaving a small scar as a reminder of the battle. But otherwise, it was intact. It had survived. From that moment on, it ceased to be just a house. It became a legend, a symbol of indestructibility. In a city washed off the face of the earth, it was proof that one could endure, that even in the face of apocalypse, there is hope. Josephine lived in it for many more years, but the castle's fate was already sealed. In 1923, after her death, the Gresham children, long scattered across the country, sold the house, and the buyer was the Catholic Diocese of Galveston. An incredible transformation took place. The house, built as a monument to secular power, the power of money and steel, became the residence of spiritual power. The railroad baron's fortress turned into the bishop's palace. It was then that it received the name it is known by today, the Bishop's Palace. Ironically, the creation of the Protestant Gresham passed into the hands of the Catholic architect, Clayton, and then to the Catholic Church. For decades, it served as a home for bishops, withstanding new storms, including the furious Hurricane Carla in 1961, each time reaffirming its legendary strength. And then, when the burden of its upkeep became too great, the Church transferred it to a historical foundation, opening its doors to the world. We return to the present day. An historian stands against the backdrop of the castle, bathed in the rays of the setting sun. Walter Gresham wanted to build a monument to his power, his dynasty, his eternity. In this, he failed. His dynasty did not rule Galveston. His name has been all but forgotten, replaced by the house's new name. But in the greatest of ironies, his obsession with strength, his almost fanatical drive to build something indestructible, created something far greater. He didn't create a monument to himself. He created a monument to the resilience of the human spirit. The castle outlived its creator. It outlived his family. It outlived the storm that destroyed an entire city. It outlived the changing of eras. It did all this to find a soul that its builder had never intended to give it. The soul of a savior, the soul of a guardian, a stone heart that, in the darkest hour, proved capable of mercy. Final shot. The sun sets behind the castle's towers. It stands, as it did a century ago, silent, eternal, and indestructible, a witness to the fact that true greatness is measured not by the Creator's intent, but by the creation's ability to serve a purpose higher than any human pride. Our dive into the mysteries of the Bishop's Palace was not just an investigation, but an odyssey through the paradoxes of human ambition. We descended to the deep foundations on shifting sand and climbed to the griffins gazing at the ocean, trying to understand how one man's will can be turned into stone. All these stories, from predatory deals to the prayers of survivors, lead to one stunning conclusion. We have no control over the true meaning of what we create. A man can lay his pride, his strength, and his contempt for weakness into granite. But only time, tragedy, and compassion can breathe a soul into stone. The fortress, built to protect a dynasty, only found its greatness when its doors opened to protect humanity. And Walter Gresham's castle leaves us with eternal questions. What ultimately defines a legacy? The original design or the eventual service? And can we, by building indestructible monuments to ourselves, accidentally erect a saving beacon for others? The story of the Bishop's Palace is not over. It continues in everyone who tries to answer these questions. Share your thoughts in the comments. What do this castle and its story mean to you? Your support, with a like and a subscription, allows us to continue searching for answers frozen in stone.